Close your eyes for a moment, my friends. Take a slow breath. Let the day fade away for a while. Listen to the quiet sounds around you. Maybe there is a fan turning slowly in the dark. Maybe a car passes far away on a night road. Maybe the faint glow of a screen rests beside you, and on that screen are words written in English. Words in a message. Words in a song. Words in a story. English is everywhere now. It appears in films, in music, in airports, in classrooms, in books, and in quiet conversations between people who live oceans apart. It feels ordinary. It feels natural. But tonight, I want to ask a gentle question. How did this language travel so far? The story of English does not begin with power. It does not begin with kings who planned a world language. It does not begin in grand libraries or great universities. The story begins in uncertainty. It begins with people trying to survive in a changing land. Long ago, the island we now call England was not an English-speaking place at all. It was a land of forests, rivers, hills covered with mist, and small tribal communities. The people who lived there spoke Celtic languages. Their words rose from the soil of the land itself. Their stories moved through generations by memory and voice. When we look at the map of Britain today, some old place names still carry faint echoes of that ancient world. Then another power arrived from far away. The Romans came across the sea. They brought soldiers, engineers, laws, roads, and a language called Latin. For centuries, Britain became part of the Roman world. Stone towns appeared where villages once stood. Straight roads crossed the land. Trade moved more easily. Roman rule brought order, but it also brought cultural change. Latin became the language of administration, law, and learning, yet something quiet continued beneath the surface. The ordinary people did not simply forget their own ways of speaking. The language of daily life often survives in places where power cannot reach easily. It survives in homes. It survives in fields. It survives in the gentle voice of a parent speaking to a child before sleep. When Roman power slowly faded in the 5th century, Britain entered a time of uncertainty. Without the protection of Roman armies, the island became vulnerable. New groups of people began to cross the sea. These newcomers were known as the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. They came from regions connected to what we now call Germany and Denmark. They brought their families, their customs, and their own ways of speaking. These Germanic languages were very different from the Celtic languages already on the island. Over time, as these groups settled and built new communities, their speech began to dominate large parts of the land. From their voices, a new language slowly began to grow. This language would later be called Old English. If we could hear Old English today, it might sound almost like a completely different language. Many of its words would be unfamiliar. Its sounds would feel rough and distant, yet hidden inside that early speech were the seeds of the language we know today. Old English was not elegant in the way modern people sometimes expect language to be. It was strong and practical. It belonged to everyday life. It named the wind, the rain, the animals in the field, the bread on the table, the fire in the hearth, and the bonds of family. Words like house, bread, mother, father, and night come from those ancient roots. These simple words have survived for more than 1,000 years because they describe the most basic parts of human life. In those early centuries, England was not a single united country. Instead, it was divided into several kingdoms. Northumbria lay in the north. Mercia stood in the Middle Lands. Wessex grew powerful in the south. Kent and East Anglia formed other centers of life and power. Each kingdom had its own leaders, its own customs, and its own ways of speaking. There was no single authority deciding how English should sound or how it should be written. Instead, the language grew naturally in many places at once. It was spoken in wooden halls, in market squares, in farms and villages scattered across the countryside. Like small fires burning in many homes, the language lived in many forms at the same time. This kind of growth can look messy to people who expect rules and order, but in truth, it can also create great strength. When a language belongs to ordinary people, it becomes deeply rooted in daily life. It becomes part of how communities understand themselves. Old English developed rich poetic traditions as well. Early poems described warriors, journeys across cold seas, and the struggle between fate and courage. One of the most famous works from this time is the epic poem Beowulf. In its verses, we hear echoes of a world filled with danger, loyalty, honor, and deep reflection on life and death. Even though the language of Beowulf feels distant to us now, the emotions inside the poem remain surprisingly familiar. Another important change began when Christianity spread through Anglo-Saxon England. Missionaries and monks brought new religious ideas, but they also brought books and learning. Monasteries became centers of writing and scholarship. Latin remained the language of church learning, but monks also began to write in English. This decision was powerful. When a language begins to appear in written form, it gains a new kind of memory. Spoken words disappear into the air, but written words can travel through centuries. Laws, prayers, and historical records started to appear in Old English. This helped the language grow stronger and more confident. One king who understood the importance of learning was Alfred the Great of Wessex. In the 9th century, Alfred encouraged education and supported the translation of important works into English. He believed knowledge should not belong only to those who understood Latin. By supporting the use of English in writing, he helped the language gain respect and stability. His efforts showed that English could do more than describe everyday life. It could also carry knowledge, reflection, and history. Yet the story of English was far from peaceful. Even as the language was finding its voice, new storms were gathering over the sea. From the cold northern waters came the long ships of Scandinavian warriors. These were the Vikings. At first they came as raiders, attacking coastal towns and monasteries. Their arrival brought fear and destruction, but over time, many Vikings did not simply leave after their raids. Some stayed. They settled in parts of England and built communities of their own. When people from different cultures live side by side, language begins to change in surprising ways. The Vikings spoke Old Norse, a language related to Old English. Because the two languages were cousins, people could sometimes understand parts of each other's speech. This closeness allowed words to move from one language into another. Over time, everyday words from Norse entered English. Words like sky, egg, window, take, and call all come from that contact. Even the pronouns they, them, and their entered English through this northern influence. Imagine that. Words we use every day carry memories of a time when strangers arrived by sea and slowly became neighbors. This moment reveals something important about English. The language did not survive by protecting itself from all outside influence. Instead, it survived by adapting. It borrowed words when they were useful. It allowed its structure to shift when communication demanded it. This flexibility made English resilient. A language that refuses to change can become fragile, but a language that learns to bend may survive many storms. As the centuries passed, English continued to grow and change under many pressures. Kingdoms fought for power, cultures mixed, old traditions met new influences. Through all of this, the language kept moving forward. It was still far from the English we know today, but the foundations were already forming. The language of farmers, sailors, monks, and storytellers was slowly becoming something larger. Yet an even greater turning point was waiting in the future, a moment that would shake the language to its core. In the year 1066, a new conqueror would arrive from across the sea. His victory would change England forever, and for a long time after that day, English would no longer be the language of power in its own land. But that part of the story comes next. For now, let the image rest in your mind. A cold island beneath a wide gray sky. Small villages scattered across the land. Fires burning inside wooden halls. And in those halls, people speaking a language that is still young, still uncertain, and still finding its shape. None of them know that the words they speak will one day travel across the entire world. They are simply speaking because human beings must speak. They speak to share food, to warn of danger, to comfort a child, to tell a story beside the fire. And in those quiet voices, the long journey of the English language truly begins. The wind is cold over the northern sea, my friends. The sky is heavy with clouds, and the water moves slowly beneath a pale gray light. Somewhere far away from the shores of England, long wooden ships move across the waves. The men on those ships are strong sailors. They know the language of wind and water. They know storms. They know hunger. They know war. But they do not know that they are sailing toward a place that will change the future of a language. History often begins this way. quietly, without anyone realizing what the future will remember. By the time we arrive at this moment, Old English already lives across much of the island. It is spoken in villages, in farms, in halls where warriors gather at night, and in markets where traders exchange goods. It is the language of daily life. It names the land, the weather, the animals, the tools people use, and the bonds between families. But England is still not a single peaceful kingdom. Different rulers compete for power. Different regions grow in strength. The land is alive with movement and uncertainty. Then, in the late 8th century, something new begins to appear on the horizon. Ships from Scandinavia approach the coast of Britain. These ships are narrow and fast. Their sails rise like wings above the sea. The people who sail them come from lands we now know as Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. Today, we often call them Vikings. At first, they arrive as raiders. They attack coastal towns and monasteries. They take treasure and supplies. Then they disappear again across the water. For the people living on the English coast, these first raids must have felt terrifying. Imagine a quiet monastery beside the sea. The monks are copying books by candlelight. Outside, the wind carries the smell of salt and cold air. Suddenly, the silence breaks. Shouts echo across the shore. Ships arrive. Doors break open. Fire spreads. The peaceful rhythm of prayer and writing disappears in moments of chaos. To those who lived through these attacks, the Vikings were not a future cultural influence. They were simply danger arriving from the sea. But history rarely remains simple. Over time, the story changes. Some Scandinavian warriors begin to stay in England instead of leaving. They settle on the land. They build farms and villages. They trade with local people. They marry. They raise children. Slowly, the island becomes a place where different groups live side by side. This is the moment when language begins to change in deeper ways. The Vikings speak Old Norse. Old Norse is not the same as Old English, but it is related. Both languages come from the same larger Germanic family. Because of this, many words sound similar. Many ideas can be understood with a little effort. Imagine two neighbors who speak different dialects of a similar language. At first, communication may be difficult, but with patience, they begin to understand each other. This is exactly what happens in many parts of England. When two communities live together, they must find ways to speak to one another. A farmer needs to trade food. A fisherman needs to sell his catch. A traveler needs directions. A child playing with another child does not stop because their languages are slightly different. Instead, people begin to adapt. They repeat words that seem familiar. They shorten phrases. They borrow expressions that are easy to understand. Over time, the language spoken around them slowly changes. Because of this contact, many Old Norse words enter the English language. Some of these words are surprisingly common today. Words like sky, egg, window, sister, law, take, call, and die all came from Old Norse influence. Even the pronouns they, them, and their have Scandinavian roots. Think about how often we use these words in everyday speech. Every time we say them, we are unknowingly repeating echoes from those centuries when Norse settlers and English villagers lived side by side. Language change does not happen in one dramatic moment. It happens slowly across many lives. A child hears one form of a word from a parent and another form from a neighbor. A trader repeats the word that customers understand most easily. A storyteller chooses the expression that feels clearer to the listener. Over time, certain forms survive because they work better for communication. Other forms slowly disappear. Scholars believe that this long contact between Old English and Old Norse also helped simplify parts of English grammar. In earlier Germanic languages, many words changed their endings depending on how they were used in a sentence. These endings helped show relationships between words. But when people speaking related languages try to understand one another, these complex endings can cause confusion. Slowly, some of these endings began to fade. Word order became more important in showing meaning. This shift did not happen overnight. It took generations. But it helped move English toward the simpler grammatical structure we know today. In the northern and eastern parts of England, Scandinavian influence became especially strong. These regions were sometimes known as the Danelaw. In these areas, Norse customs and English customs mixed together. New communities formed. Trade networks expanded. And through all of this, language continued to evolve. What makes this part of the story remarkable is that English did not disappear under this pressure. It changed, but it survived. Some languages try to remain pure by rejecting outside influence. English followed a different path. It absorbed what was useful. It welcomed new words. It allowed its structure to shift when necessary. This flexibility became one of the language's greatest strengths. Think about a tree standing in a storm. A rigid tree may break when strong winds arrive, but a tree that bends with the wind may survive. English was like that bending tree. It did not resist every outside influence. Instead, it learned how to adapt. And because it adapted, it continued to live. At the same time, the political situation in England remained unstable. Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fought to defend their lands. Viking armies sometimes returned with greater strength. Battles shaped the future of the island again and again. In this difficult period, one leader stood out as especially important. His name was Alfred the Great, the King of Wessex. Alfred fought against Viking expansion and helped protect parts of England from complete control by Scandinavian forces. But he did something else that mattered deeply for the future of English. Alfred believed that knowledge should be available to his people. He encouraged the translation of important Latin works into English. He supported education and learning. In doing so, he helped strengthen the role of English as a language of writing and thought. This was a powerful decision. When a language appears in books, laws, and records, it gains stability. It becomes part of history itself. English was no longer only the language of farmers and villagers. It was becoming a language capable of carrying knowledge. Still, the future remained uncertain. English had survived Roman rule. It had survived migration and cultural mixing. It had survived Viking raids and settlement, but even greater change was approaching. Across the sea, another power was rising. This power did not come from Scandinavia, but from a region across the English Channel known as Normandy. The people of Normandy spoke a form of French shaped by Viking ancestors who had settled there generations earlier. Their culture was different. Their language was different, and in the year 1066, their leader would cross the sea to claim the English throne. When William of Normandy defeated the English king at the Battle of Hastings, the history of England entered a new chapter. The language of power would soon change. The rulers of the land would speak French. The courts, the government, and the nobility would follow their language. For English, this moment would become one of its greatest tests. The language that had survived centuries of struggle would now face something even more difficult than invasion. It would face humiliation. English would remain the language of the common people, but it would lose its place among the powerful. For many years, it would stand in the shadow of another language. And yet, as we will soon see, this humiliation would not destroy English. Instead, it would transform it. But that part of the story waits for the next chapter of our journey together. The year is 1066, my friends. The sky above England is gray, and the wind moves across the fields like a warning. On the southern coast, soldiers gather. They carry shields and spears. Their armor is heavy. Their faces are tense. They know that something important is about to happen, but they cannot fully imagine how deeply this moment will change their world. Across the sea, another army is coming. Its leader is William, Duke of Normandy. His ships move steadily toward the English shore, and with those ships comes a future that will reshape the English language itself. When the armies finally meet near a place called Hastings, the battle is fierce and chaotic. Arrows fly through the air. Horses charge across the field. The sounds of metal, shouting, and fear fill the morning. By the end of that day, the English king, Harold, is dead. William of Normandy becomes the new ruler of England. This moment is remembered in history as the Norman Conquest. For the people living through it, the change must have felt sudden and overwhelming. A new ruling class had arrived. New laws would follow. New customs would appear. And perhaps most surprising of all, a new language would rise to power. The Normans spoke a form of French known as Norman French. This language came from the Romance family, very different from the Germanic roots of Old English. When the Normans took control of England, French quickly became the language of the royal court, the government, and the nobility. Important decisions were made in French. Legal discussions happened in French. The language of the ruling elite was no longer the language spoken by most of the people. Latin also remained powerful. It was still used by the church and by scholars. Important records were often written in Latin. This meant that England now had three languages living side by side. French dominated the court and the upper classes. Latin held authority in religion and learning. English remained the language of farmers, workers, and everyday conversation. Imagine living in such a world. In the fields and villages, people speak English just as they always have. Mothers comfort their children in English. Farmers trade animals and grain in English. Stories are told beside the fire in English. But when someone enters a royal court or deals with the law, the language changes. Suddenly, French fills the room. A person's speech can reveal their place in society. Language becomes a sign of status. For many generations after the Norman conquest, English lost much of its prestige. The powerful families often preferred French. Children of the nobility learned French as their main language. English was rarely used in official documents. It seemed for a time that English might slowly fade into a lower position in society. But something remarkable happened. English did not disappear. The reason is simple, yet powerful. Most of the people in England continued to speak English every day. The language lived in homes, farms, markets, and villages. It lived in laughter, at arguments, in songs and stories, in the quiet words spoken between friends. A language that lives in the daily life of millions of people cannot easily vanish. Over time, the languages of England began to influence one another. French words entered English in large numbers. Many of these words were connected to government, law, culture, and refined living. Words such as court, judge, government, beauty, color, music, and dinner all came from French influence. This mixing of languages created something new. English began to develop a layered vocabulary. One fascinating example appears in the language of food. The animals in the field often kept their Old English names. Words like cow, pig, and sheep remained part of everyday English. But when those animals were prepared and served at the table of the nobility, the words often came from French. Beef came from the French word bœuf. Pork came from porc. Mutton came from mouton. In a simple meal, the history of conquest could still be heard. This mixture of languages made English richer but also more complex. Words from different origins carried different feelings and levels of formality. Sometimes English developed two words for similar ideas. One word might sound simple and direct, while another sounded more formal. For example, the English word freedom existed alongside the French-influenced word liberty. The English word help existed beside the French-influenced assist. These pairs of words gave English a special ability to move between different tones of speech. During this time, English itself was changing. The Old English spoken before the Norman conquest slowly evolved into what scholars call Middle English. Grammar became simpler. Many old endings disappeared. Word order became more important for understanding meaning. The language was becoming easier in some ways and more expressive in others. Yet for many years, English still remained outside the highest levels of power. If someone wanted to rise in the royal court, knowledge of French was important. French remained the language of prestige for generations. But history is never still. Over time, the descendants of the Norman rulers began to see England as their true home. Political ties with France became more complicated. Wars between England and France slowly changed loyalties. As these changes happened, English began to rise again. By the 14th century, English was slowly returning to public life. Government documents began to appear in English once more. Schools started teaching in English. Literature written in English grew more common. One of the most famous writers of this period was Geoffrey Chaucer. Chaucer wrote The Canterbury Tales, a collection of stories told by travelers on a journey. His work showed that English could be lively, humorous, thoughtful, and rich in character. The language of Chaucer still feels different from modern English, but it is much closer to what we understand today. His writing helped show that English was not only the language of ordinary people, it could also be a language of art and storytelling. At this moment, English was changing rapidly. It carried Germanic roots from the Anglo-Saxons. It held Norse influences from the Viking Age. It had absorbed thousands of French words after the Norman conquest. These different layers created a language that was flexible and expressive. English could speak in the voice of farmers and kings, soldiers and poets. yet the language still had no single standard form. Different regions spoke different dialects. Spelling was inconsistent. The same word might appear in many different forms depending on where it was written. English was alive, but it was not yet unified. That moment of unity would arrive with another powerful invention, a machine that would change language forever. The printing press. When books could suddenly be produced in large numbers, choices had to be made about spelling, vocabulary, and style. Those choices would slowly shape the English language into a more standardized form. But that transformation belongs to the next part of our journey. For now, imagine England in the centuries after the Norman conquest. The land is changing. Languages mix in markets and towns. French echoes through castles. Latin fills the quiet halls of monasteries. And among all of these voices, English continues to live in the speech of ordinary people. It is not the language of kings anymore, but it is still the language of the people. And sometimes, my friends, the language of the people is the one that survives the longest. The centuries pass slowly, my friends. The winds still move across the green fields of England. Villages grow, markets expand, and people continue their daily lives. But something quiet is happening beneath the surface of society. English, the language once pushed aside by the Norman rulers, is beginning to rise again, not with a sudden victory, not with a loud announcement. It returns gradually, like the slow light of morning spreading across the land. After the Norman conquest, French had dominated the world of power for many generations. Kings spoke French. Nobles spoke French. Important legal discussions often happened in French. Latin continued to hold authority in the church and in scholarship. For a long time, English seemed to exist mainly among the common people. It was heard in farms, in markets, and in homes, but rarely in royal halls. Yet, history has its own rhythm. Over the centuries, the descendants of the Norman rulers slowly became more English in identity. Many noble families had lived in England for generations. They were born on English soil, they governed English land, and gradually they began to speak English again. At the same time, the political connection between England and France became more complicated. Rivalries grew stronger. Wars between the two kingdoms changed loyalties. One of the most important of these conflicts was the long struggle later known as the 100 Years' War. Although the war lasted far longer than its name suggests, its deeper effect was cultural as well as political. As England and France fought each other, the English nobility slowly began to distance themselves from French identity. The language of the people started to regain respect. By the 14th century, English was returning to places where it had once been absent. Schools increasingly used English for teaching. Government officials began to write some records in English again. In 1362, the English language even returned to the legal system when Parliament passed the Statute of Pleading. This law allowed English to be used in court proceedings because, as the law itself explained, many people did not understand French. Think about what that means. For nearly 3 centuries, the language of the majority had been excluded from official power. Now, slowly and carefully, it was returning. But this was not the same English that existed before the Norman conquest. The language had changed deeply during those long centuries. Old English had evolved into Middle English. Thousands of French words had entered the vocabulary. Grammar had simplified. Old endings had disappeared. Word order had become more important in sentences. The language that emerged from this transformation was more flexible and expressive than before. English now carried layers of history inside it. Some words felt strong and simple, coming from its Anglo-Saxon roots. Other words felt elegant or formal, coming from French influence. These layers allowed English speakers to choose different tones depending on the situation. For example, a person might say, "ask" in simple conversation, but "inquire" in formal speech. Someone might speak of freedom in everyday life, but liberty in a political discussion. Both ideas mean something similar, yet they carry different emotional colors. This richness became one of the defining features of English. During this period of change, literature played a powerful role in shaping the language's future. Writers began to show that English could be used not only for ordinary conversation, but also for great storytelling. Among these writers, one name stands above many others: Geoffrey Chaucer. Chaucer lived in the 14th century and worked as a diplomat, civil servant, and writer. His most famous work, The Canterbury Tales, tells the story of a group of travelers making a journey to a religious shrine. Along the way, Each traveler tells a story. Some stories are funny, some are serious, some reveal the beauty and weakness of human nature. What makes Chaucer especially important is that he chose to write these stories in English rather than French or Latin. At the time, this was a powerful cultural decision. By writing in English, Chaucer helped prove that the language of ordinary people could also carry complex ideas, humor, philosophy, and art. Readers who look at Chaucer's original writing today may still find it difficult to understand. Middle English spelling and pronunciation were very different from modern forms, yet the structure of the language is clearly moving toward what we recognize today. Chaucer's voice stands at a bridge between the older world of medieval speech and the emerging language of modern England. But even as English gained literary strength, it remained far from standardized. In Chaucer's time, there was no official spelling system. Different writers spelled the same word in many different ways. Pronunciation also varied greatly across regions. The English spoken in the north could sound quite different from the English spoken in London. Imagine traveling across the country in those days. In one town, a familiar word might sound slightly different. In another town, it might change again. These regional dialects gave English a vibrant and living quality, but they also made communication more complex, especially as trade and travel increased. At the same time, England itself was changing rapidly. Towns grew larger. Trade expanded across Europe. Merchants carried goods, ideas, and language between regions. The social structure of the country slowly shifted as well. The devastating outbreak of the Black Death in the 14th century dramatically reduced the population of England. Labor became more valuable. Workers gained slightly more economic power. These social changes helped strengthen the role of English. As more people moved between regions for work and trade, the need for broader communication increased. English became the language that connected these different communities. By the late Middle Ages, the language had clearly returned from the shadows. It was once again a language of government, literature, and everyday life. Yet it was still evolving quickly. Spelling remained inconsistent. Pronunciation was beginning to shift in ways that would later be called the Great Vowel Shift, one of the most important sound changes in the history of English. The stage was now set for a transformation that would change the language forever. This transformation would not come from a king or a war. It would come from a machine made of metal, wood, ink, and paper, the printing press. When printing arrived in England in the late 15th century, it would spread English words farther and faster than ever before. Books could now reach many more readers. Writers and printers would begin making decisions about spelling and grammar that would shape the language for centuries. The English language had survived conquest. It had survived centuries of low status. It had survived deep cultural mixing. Now, it was ready for a new chapter, a chapter in which its voice would grow louder, clearer, and more widely heard. And that chapter begins with the quiet turning of a printing press. The room is quiet, my friends. A wooden table stands near a window. Outside, the streets of London are busy with merchants, travelers, and workers moving through narrow lanes. Inside the room, a man carefully places small pieces of metal into a frame. Each tiny piece carries a letter. He covers the letters with ink. Then he lowers a heavy press onto a sheet of paper. When he lifts the press again, something remarkable appears. Words, clear, dark, and repeated perfectly. This moment may seem small. Just ink on paper, just a machine pressing letters onto a page. But in truth, it is one of the turning points in the history of the English language. The man in that room is named William Caxton. In the late 15th century, he brings the printing press to England. Before this invention, books had to be copied by hand. Monks and scribes spent long hours writing each page carefully. This work required great patience and skill. Because of this, books were rare and expensive. Only a small number of people could own them. But printing changes everything. With a printing press, hundreds of copies of a text can be produced much faster than before. Books begin to travel farther. Ideas begin to move more quickly through society. And most importantly for our story, language itself begins to stabilize. Before printing, spelling in English was extremely flexible. One writer might spell a word in one way, while another writer might choose a completely different form. Even the same writer might spell the same word differently in different parts of a text. There was no official rulebook for spelling. When printers began producing books, they had to make choices. Each page required careful arrangement of metal letters. Changing spellings too often would slow the printing process, so printers preferred consistency. They selected certain spellings and used them again and again. Over time, readers began to see the same forms repeatedly. Slowly, those forms started to feel normal. In this way, printing helped shape what we now call Standard English. London played an important role in this process. As the political and commercial center of England, the language spoken around London had strong influence. Printers working there often used local forms of English when preparing books. Because these books spread across the country, the London style of English gradually became more familiar to readers in many regions. But the printing press did more than standardize spelling. It also helped English gain confidence as a language of knowledge and creativity. When books became easier to produce, writers had new opportunities to share their ideas. Histories, poems, stories, religious texts, and scientific works began to appear in English more often. Readers who once depended on Latin or French could now explore ideas in their own language. This change helped strengthen the cultural identity of England. English was no longer only the language of daily conversation. It was becoming the language of literature, scholarship, and national life. As the 16th century arrived, England entered a period of extraordinary cultural energy. This was the age of the Renaissance, a time when interest in art, science, and classical learning expanded across Europe. English writers and thinkers became deeply involved in this movement. Scholars translated ancient Greek and Roman works into English. New discoveries in science required new vocabulary. As a result, many words entered English from Latin and Greek during this time. Words connected to medicine, philosophy, astronomy, and education enriched the language further. Some people worried that English was borrowing too many foreign words. They feared that the language might lose its identity. But others believed that these new words made English more powerful. The language was growing larger, capable of expressing ideas that had once belonged only to Latin. Among the many voices of this vibrant age, one stands above the rest: William Shakespeare. Shakespeare was born in 1564 in the town of Stratford-upon-Avon. Over the course of his life, he became one of the most influential writers in the English language. His plays and poems showed just how flexible and expressive English had become. On the stage, Shakespeare used language in extraordinary ways. His characters could speak with humor, anger, love, jealousy, fear, and wisdom. He combined simple everyday words with poetic imagery. He played with rhythm and sound. Sometimes he even invented new words or gave old words new meanings. Many phrases that sound familiar today first appeared in Shakespeare's writing. Expressions like break the ice, wild goose chase, and heart of gold all trace back to his works. His language captured the full range of human experience. What makes Shakespeare especially remarkable is that his writing reached many different audiences. His plays were performed not only for nobles, but also for ordinary people. In the crowded theaters of London, merchants, craftsmen, sailors, and scholars could all stand together and listen to the same lines. Through Shakespeare and other writers of his time, English proved something important. It proved that it could carry the weight of deep emotion, complex thought, and artistic beauty. At the same time, England itself was expanding its reach across the seas. Ships sailed toward new lands in North America, Africa, and Asia. Trade networks connected England with distant regions of the world. As sailors, traders, and settlers traveled, they carried the English language with them. The spread of English beyond the British Isles was not always peaceful. Exploration often came together with conquest and colonization. New territories were claimed. Indigenous peoples faced enormous disruption. Languages and cultures encountered one another under unequal conditions. Yet wherever English traveled, it continued to change. Words from other languages entered English vocabulary. Names of plants, animals, foods, and cultural practices from around the world became part of English speech. The language absorbed influences from Dutch, Spanish, Arabic, Hindi, and many other sources. In this way, English continued the pattern it had followed for centuries. It adapted, it borrowed, it expanded. The language that had once been spoken in scattered Anglo-Saxon villages was now crossing oceans. Printing presses multiplied its words. Theaters filled with its voices. Ships carried it across the globe. And still, the journey of English was far from complete. Because in the centuries ahead, the language would spread even farther than anyone in Shakespeare's time could imagine. It would travel to new continents. It would grow into many different forms, and eventually, it would become one of the most widely used languages in human history. But that transformation belongs to the next chapter of our story. For now, let us remain for a moment in that small printing room where ink first touched paper under Caxton's press. The sound of the machine is steady and quiet. Page after page emerges from the press. Each page carries words that will travel farther than any voice alone could carry them. And with every printed line, the English language moves one step closer to the world. The sea is wide, my friends. The wind moves across dark water, pushing tall ships forward into the unknown. On the decks of those ships stand sailors, traders, soldiers, and dreamers. Some look toward the horizon with hope. Some carry fear in their hearts. None of them truly understand how far their journey will change the world, and none of them know that the language they speak will soon begin traveling farther than ever before. By the 17th century, England is changing quickly. The country is no longer only a small island kingdom. Trade is expanding. Ships move constantly between ports. Merchants bring goods from distant lands. New maps are drawn. New sea routes are discovered. Curiosity about the wider world grows stronger each year. With this expansion comes movement. People begin leaving England to settle in other parts of the world. Some travel in search of land and opportunity. Some go as traders or explorers. Others are forced into difficult journeys shaped by poverty, punishment, or conflict. Whatever their reason for leaving, they carry something important with them. They carry their language. When English speakers arrive in new lands, their language does not remain exactly the same. Language always changes when it meets new places and new people. In North America, English settlers encounter indigenous communities who already speak many rich and complex languages. These encounters are not always peaceful. Many indigenous societies face enormous loss and disruption as European colonization spreads. Yet through contact, exchange, and survival, languages influence one another. New words enter English to describe unfamiliar landscapes, animals, and plants. Words such as raccoon, moose, and skunk come from indigenous languages of North America. These words remind us that English does not grow alone. It grows through contact with other cultures. As English spreads to colonies in North America, it begins to develop its own character. Distance from Britain changes pronunciation and vocabulary. Life in new environments creates new expressions. Over time, what we now call American English begins to take shape. The language of England is slowly becoming a family of related forms rather than a single uniform voice. At the same time, English travels to many other parts of the world. British ships reach the Caribbean, Africa, South Asia, Australia, and the Pacific. Trade routes stretch across oceans. The British Empire gradually expands during the 18th and 19th centuries. Wherever British power goes, the English language often follows. It becomes the language of administration, education, and international trade in many regions. Schools teach English. Government documents appear in English. Communication between distant colonies often happens in English as well. But the spread of English is not a simple story of one language replacing others. In many places, English mixes with local languages and cultures. New varieties of English emerge. Accents change, grammar adapts, local vocabulary enters the language. In India, for example, English becomes deeply connected to education and government during the colonial period. Over time, Indian English develops its own rhythms and expressions influenced by the country's many languages. In the Caribbean, English blends with African languages and European influences to create new Creole languages full of life and creativity. In Australia and New Zealand, English adapts to new landscapes and cultures. Unique words appear to describe unfamiliar animals, environments, and experiences. In Africa, English becomes one of several languages used in communication across diverse communities. Each of these places shapes English in its own way. This is an important moment in the history of the language. English is no longer only the language of one nation. It is becoming a global language with many forms and many voices. During the 19th century, another powerful change arrives: the Industrial Revolution. New machines transform how people work. Factories rise in growing cities. Railways connect distant towns. Steamships shorten travel time across oceans. With these technological changes comes an explosion of new vocabulary. Words related to science, engineering, and industry enter English quickly. Terms like engine, electricity, locomotive, and factory become part of everyday speech. Scientific discoveries also expand the language of knowledge. English becomes increasingly important in fields such as medicine, physics, and chemistry. The growth of newspapers and printed materials also spreads English more widely among the population. Literacy rates rise. More people learn to read and write. Books, newspapers, and pamphlets carry English ideas into homes and workplaces. By the end of the 19th century, English has traveled farther than anyone in earlier centuries could have imagined. It is spoken across continents. It appears in government offices, universities, shipping ports, and classrooms around the world. Yet something interesting is happening at the same time. The more English spreads, the more it changes. Different regions develop different accents. New words appear in one country and not in another. Spelling differences even emerge between British and American English. For example, the British spelling color becomes color in American English. Center becomes center. These changes reflect the growing independence of English-speaking societies. Language, after all, belongs to the people who use it, and now millions of people across the world are shaping English in their own ways. By the beginning of the 20th century, English stands at the edge of another transformation. New technologies are about to change communication once again. Voices will travel through radio waves. Stories will appear on cinema screens. Later, television and the internet will connect people across the planet in ways never before imagined. The language that once grew quietly among small villages on a misty island is now preparing to enter a global age, an age where English will be heard not only in ships and books, but in music, movies, science, and everyday conversation between people from many different cultures. And in that new world, English will continue to evolve, shaped by millions of voices speaking it in their own unique ways. But that story belongs to the next part of our journey. The 20th century arrives quietly at first, my friends. The world grows faster. Cities grow larger. Machines become stronger. And slowly, something extraordinary begins to happen to the English language. It starts to move not only across oceans, but through invisible waves in the air. Imagine a small living room in the early 1900s. A family sits around a wooden table. In the corner of the room stands a strange new device, a radio. When it turns on, voices fill the room, voices from far away. News, music, and stories travel through the air itself, and many of those voices speak English. For the first time in history, a language can reach millions of people at the same moment. Radio spreads English across countries and continents. Later, cinema brings English voices to giant screens in dark theaters. Actors speak lines that audiences repeat and remember. Then television arrives, carrying English speech directly into homes. Families gather around glowing screens, listening to stories, news, and entertainment. The English language is no longer limited to books and letters. It now travels through sound and image. It becomes part of everyday global culture. At the same time, the 20th century sees enormous political and economic change. After 2 world wars, the influence of the United States grows rapidly. American music, films, technology, and business spread across the world. Hollywood movies reach audiences everywhere. Jazz, rock, and later pop music carry English lyrics into the ears of millions. Suddenly, people in distant countries begin learning English not only for politics or trade, but also for entertainment and connection. A song becomes a teacher. A movie becomes a classroom. A television program becomes a bridge between cultures. In universities and laboratories, English also becomes increasingly important. Scientific research is often published in English so that scholars from different countries can share discoveries. International conferences use English as a common language. Pilots and air traffic controllers communicate in English for safety across global air travel. In this way, English becomes something new. It becomes a global bridge language. A bridge language does not belong to one group alone. It is used by people who speak many different native languages but need a shared way to communicate. English gradually takes on this role in international business, science, diplomacy, and education. But something interesting happens when millions of people use a language that did not begin in their country. They shape it. They give it new sounds. They give it new rhythms. They give it new rhythms. They give it new words and expressions. The result is that English becomes not one language, but many living varieties. American English develops its own accents and vocabulary. British English continues to evolve in its own way. Australian English forms its own identity. Indian English carries the influence of the many languages spoken across the subcontinent. Nigerian English reflects the vibrant linguistic diversity of West Africa. Singapore English develops unique rhythms shaped by the meeting of Asian languages and global trade. All of these forms are English. They sound different, they use different expressions, but they remain connected through shared history and mutual understanding. This diversity sometimes surprises learners of the language. A person studying English may ask, which English is the correct one? The answer is not always simple. Standard forms exist for education and formal writing, but real English lives in many voices. Language belongs to the people who speak it, and now English is spoken by hundreds of millions of people across the world. Even more remarkable, many of those speakers are not native speakers. In fact, today there are more people who speak English as a second or third language than those who learned it as children at home. This changes the nature of the language itself. English becomes a shared tool rather than a possession of one country. A scientist from Japan may discuss research with a colleague from Brazil in English. A business meeting may bring together people from Germany, India, and Kenya, all speaking English to understand one another. Students from dozens of countries may study together in English at the same university. In each conversation, English adapts slightly to the speakers involved. The grammar may become simpler. The accents may vary. New expressions may appear. But communication still happens. And that is what language is meant to do. Yet the rise of global English also raises important questions. Some people worry that smaller languages may disappear as English becomes more dominant in education and media. Languages carry culture, history, and identity. When a language disappears, a unique way of seeing the world can disappear with it. Because of this, many communities work hard to protect their native languages while still learning English as a global tool. The future of language may not be a world where one language replaces all others. Instead, it may be a world where people speak several languages, each serving a different purpose. English as a bridge, local languages as roots. This balance allows cultures to remain strong while communication between nations remains possible. Another fascinating feature of modern English is how quickly it now changes. The internet has created a new environment for language. Messages travel instantly between continents. Social media allows people to create new expressions that spread across the world in days. A phrase invented in one country may become popular globally within weeks. Online communities develop their own vocabulary and humor. Technology also creates new words almost every year. Words like email, download, smartphone, and streaming did not exist a century ago. English continues to expand as the world changes. And still, beneath all of this modern technology, the language carries the memory of its long journey. Inside English, we can still hear echoes of the past. The Anglo-Saxon roots that gave us simple words like home and bread. The Norse influence that gave us words like sky and they. The French influence that introduced words like beauty and justice. The global influences that added words from cultures around the world. English is not a pure language. It is a layered language. A language shaped by centuries of contact, struggle, creativity, and change. And that layered history is what gives English its remarkable flexibility. It can speak in the voice of science. It can sing in music. It can tell stories on stage and screen. It can connect strangers from opposite sides of the world. The small island language has become something much larger. A meeting place for voices from many cultures. But our journey is not finished yet. There is one final part of the story left to tell. Because the history of English is not only about how the language spread across the world, it is also about what that journey means for us today. And that reflection awaits us in the final chapter of our story. Now the world grows quiet again, my friends. The long journey of our story is almost complete. We have traveled across many centuries together. We have walked through misty forests of ancient Britain. We have listened to the voices of Anglo-Saxon farmers, Viking settlers, Norman rulers, medieval poets, and Renaissance playwrights. We have stood beside printing presses, sailed across oceans, and watched the rise of radio, film, and the internet. And through all of this movement, one thing has remained constant. The English language kept changing. But perhaps the most interesting part of this story is not how English spread across the world. The most interesting part is why it survived at all. Think back to the beginning of our journey. English did not begin as a powerful language. It was not the language of great empires or ancient civilizations. It started as the speech of small communities living in uncertain times. It grew in villages and farms. It was spoken by people who had little reason to believe their language would ever become important beyond their own land. Yet the language endured. When the Romans ruled Britain, Latin held the power of government and learning. English survived quietly among ordinary people. When the Vikings arrived, English changed under pressure, absorbing new words and sounds. When the Normans conquered England, French became the language of kings and courts. English was pushed aside once again. In each of these moments, the future of English looked uncertain. But the language continued to live where it had always lived best, in the voices of ordinary people. Parents spoke it to their children. Friends used it in conversation. Workers used it in the fields and markets. Storytellers carried it from one generation to the next. This is one of the deepest truths about language. A language survives not because rulers command it, but because people use it. Over time, English did something unusual. Instead of protecting itself from outside influence, it welcomed change. It borrowed words from Norse sailors, French nobles, Latin scholars, and many other languages. Each influence left a layer inside the language. Today, English carries the marks of all those encounters. Its vocabulary is rich because it has many sources. Its structure is flexible because it has adapted again and again. It can sound simple and direct, or formal and elegant, depending on the situation. This flexibility helped English travel across the world. When the British Empire expanded, English moved with trade, government, and education. When the United States became a global economic and cultural power, English traveled even farther through music, film, technology, and science. Later, the Internet connected people across continents, making English one of the most common languages for global communication. But something even more remarkable happened along the way. English stopped belonging to only one place. It became a shared language used by people from many cultures and backgrounds. Today, someone in India may speak English with a rhythm shaped by Hindi or Tamil. Someone in Nigeria may use English expressions influenced by Yoruba or Hausa. Someone in Singapore may mix English with words from Malay or Chinese languages. Someone in Brazil or Vietnam may learn English as a bridge language for international work and travel. Each of these voices changes the language slightly, and that is not a weakness. It is a sign that the language is alive. English is no longer a single uniform voice. It is a conversation between many cultures. It carries accents, ideas, and expressions from every part of the world. If someone from the past could hear English today, they might be surprised by how many different forms it has taken. Yet, they would still recognize something familiar. Beneath all the change, the language still carries the same human purpose. It connects people. Language is not only a tool for information, it is also a bridge for understanding. Through language, we share stories, emotions, and ideas. We build friendships. We ask questions. We explain our dreams. English now serves as one of the bridges connecting people across the world. But this does not mean other languages should disappear. Every language carries its own beauty, history, and way of seeing the world. A balanced future is one where many languages continue to live, each holding its place in human culture. English may serve as a bridge, but bridges are meaningful only when they connect real and vibrant shores. And so we arrive back where we began. Perhaps tonight you are listening to this story as someone learning English. Maybe it is not the language you first heard as a child. Maybe it feels difficult sometimes. The spelling can be confusing. The pronunciation can surprise you. Some words seem simple, while others feel strangely complicated. But remember something important. You are not standing outside the story of English. You are part of it. Every person who learns and uses the language adds something new to it. Every accent, every sentence, every new idea spoken in English continues the journey that began many centuries ago. The English language has never been fixed or perfect. It has always been changing, growing, and adapting. That is why it survived. And perhaps that is also a quiet lesson for life. Strength does not always come from remaining the same. Sometimes, strength comes from learning how to change while still holding on to what matters most. The history of English is a story of resilience, a language that faced invasion, loss, and transformation again and again. Yet through each challenge, it found a way to continue. And now, in this quiet moment, somewhere in the world, someone is speaking English for the first time. a child learning new words, a student practicing pronunciation, a traveler asking a question in a foreign place, a scientist explaining a discovery, a friend sending a message across the ocean. The story continues with them, and it continues with you. Thank you for traveling through this long journey with me tonight, my friends. May the quiet lessons of history stay gently with you as the night grows deeper and the world becomes still. Until next time, my friends, sleep well.